The wind, that dry and heartless thief, dragged dust across the frontier market in thin, restless ribbons, whispering a secret it would tell to no one. Forget, forget, forget. It was as if the land itself were trying to erase what had happened there, to scour the memory from the hard-packed earth before anyone could be forced to remember it, to feel the slow-burning shame of witnessing a soul stripped bare and left for the crows of conscience to pick at. The late afternoon light was the color of forgotten honey, thick and sickly sweet, painting everything in a tired, glaring amber that felt less like illumination and more like an accusation. It turned the faces of the few lingering souls into grotesque masks of exhaustion and hollow curiosity, their eyes flat and empty as dried riverbeds. The market stalls stood not as places of trade, but as skeletal remains of commerce that had lost their purpose and their mercy long before the day had truly bled into evening. The air smelled of dust, horse dung, and the faint metallic tang of despair. On a rough wooden platform near the rust-stained watering troughs, she stood, a girl, more a collection of angles and tremors than a person in the eyes of the market. Her very stillness was a silent scream. Her feet, bare and dust-caked, were numb from hours of standing, of being displayed. The thin, scratchy blanket provided by the trader, a sop to a conscience he didn't possess, had slipped perpetually from her narrow shoulders, and each push of the cold evening air against her bare skin was a fresh humiliation, a new lesson in exposure. She felt the gazes like physical touches, not of desire, but of a cold, clinical assessment, the way one might eye a lame horse or a broken plow, calculating the cost of repair against the value of the scrap. No one wanted to look at her for long. Averted eyes were the common currency of the guilty. Those who did stare did so with a prickling discomfort that quickly soured into annoyance, or a thin, veiled amusement that curdled in the stomach. Her naked vulnerability was a personal inconvenience to them, a rude blot on the landscape they had to navigate around, rather than a living, breathing tragedy unfolding in real time. He had left her there, the traitor, vanished hours earlier into the whiskey haze of a saloon or onto the westward trail, leaving behind no explanation, no promise of return, and certainly no protection. She was a transaction abandoned mid-sentence, a commodity left on the shelf, trapped in a paralyzing, public exposure that felt like being skinned alive slowly by the collective indifference. Her breath hitched in her raw throat, a ragged little sawing sound, but she forced it into a slow, measured rhythm, counting in her head, 1, 2, 3, 4, a fragile dam against the flood of panic that threatened to shatter her bones from the inside out. Fear was not a stranger. It was a familiar, cold companion she had learned to manage, to swallow down like a bitter pill, because to let it out was to drown in a sea of your own helplessness. She had learned, through a brutal curriculum taught with fists and cold silence, that staying still and silent was safer than crying. Tears made people impatient, and impatience, in her short, hard life, was often the prelude to a sharper, more inventive cruelty. Across the square, Adam stepped down from the mayor's shaded porch, the weight of a frustrating conversation about water rights, still a dull, throbbing pressure on his shoulders. His boots hit the sun-baked dirt with a thud that felt heavier than the moment required, a punctuation mark of finality on another small losing battle. He was a man shaped not by grand events, but by the slow erosion of solitude and the sharp, enduring ache of private loss, a loss that had carved hollows beneath his cheekbones and a permanent squint into his eyes, as if he were always looking into a distance that held nothing for him. His frame was lean from long days, his hands calloused from work that left little room for reflection beyond survival and the ghostly whispers of memory that echoed in his empty cabin. He noticed the tension first, a strange, prickling silence woven into the usual market murmur, like a single, discordant thread in a coarse tapestry. He saw the way people's shoulders stiffened as they passed a certain point, how conversation stuttered and died, eyes sliding away, as if an invisible line of decency had been crossed, and they were all ashamed to be standing on the wrong side of it. It was the silence of collective guilt, heavy and sour. His own gaze, wary and weathered as old saddle leather, followed the trail of avoidance. And then he saw her. She stood beneath the vast, indifferent sky like something discarded, not something offered, not a commodity, but a casualty. Her head was bowed, not in submission, but in a practiced invisibility, a desperate hope that if she made herself small enough, the world might forget to crush her. She did not look up as his shadow, long and lean, fell across the splintered wood of the platform. It was a survival tactic etched into her soul. Looking up invited attention, attention invited questions, and questions were traps for which she had no safe answers, only ones that led to more pain. Adam stopped a few paces away, his heart a slow, thick drum in his chest, beating a funeral march for the innocents already murdered here. He was uncertain, acutely so, his own isolation making him clumsy in the face of such raw need. Would his approach be a rescue or another invasion? A kindness or a new form of confinement? He understood, in the marrow of his bones, that kindness could feel like a terrifying threat when the world has offered only betrayal, when every outstretched hand had heretofore been a prelude to a shove. "You shouldn't be here like this," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound worn smooth by disuse, meant for her ears alone. It wasn't a command. It was a quiet, aching observation that carried the weight of a shared shame, an acknowledgement that her presence here was a stain on everyone who breathed this air. The girl's fingers, white-knuckled and trembling, tightened on the filthy wool of the blanket. A minute tremor, like a plucked wire, ran through her, but she did not move. Movement could be misinterpreted as resistance, and resistance brought consequences that unfolded in the dark, away from prying eyes. "They said someone would come," she whispered to the ground, the words so faint they were almost stolen by the thieving wind. "They said it wouldn't take long." The hope in that statement was a dead, brittle thing, and a flower pressed between the pages of a cruel book. Adam felt it then, a slow, deep burn of anger that kindled in his gut. A coal sparked back to life after a long, cold season, and rose into his chest, heating the hollow places grief had left behind. It wasn't a flash of rage, but something heavier, more deliberate, a molten core of disgust that settled in and vowed to stay, to fuel him. "Who is they?" he asked, though he already knew the shape of the answer and already despised it, despised the faceless cruelty of men who traded in flesh and broken spirits. "The men who brought me," she murmured, as if naming them might summon their cruel faces back from the ether, their breath smelling of tobacco and avarice. "They said, this is how it works." This, the word hung in the air between them, bloated with horror. This platform, and this exposure, this bartering of a human soul for coin or favor. Adam's eyes swept the square, really seeing it now, the averted faces, the studied indifference. This avoidance was not neutrality. It was a form of silent participation, a complicity in something everyone wanted to disown, but hadn't the courage to confront. He moved then. Without ceremony, without a word, he shrugged out of his heavy, worn coat, the leather and wool lining still warm from his body, carrying the scent of pine smoke and honest sweat. He stepped forward, a knight approaching not a dragon, but a shattered altar, and draped it around her shoulders, his movements careful, deliberate, giving her every second to flinch away. He didn't care about the watching eyes, the assumptions, the gossip that would sprout like weeds in a rain-starved field. He cared only for the profound cold radiating from her small frame, a cold that seemed to come from deep inside, and the vast, terrifying aloneness that surrounded her like a moat of ice. She flinched, a hard, instinctual recoil, the body's memory of hurt overriding the mind's glimpse of grace. Then, as the warmth seeped into her skin, a shocking, almost painful contrast to the evening chill, and she realized he wasn't pulling, wasn't grabbing, wasn't demanding a single thing in return. A fraction of the terrible tension leaked from her shoulders. It was the first unforced movement he'd seen, a tiny landslide of held terror. "My name is Adam," he said. He offered it like an anchor thrown into a stormy sea, something solid and simple in a reality that was neither. It was all he had to give in that moment, his name. A long pause. The dust swirled in miniature tornadoes around their feet, then a whisper so fragile it might break against the air. "Lena." She said it as if testing a word in a forgotten language, as if the sound of her own name had grown strange and dangerous on her tongue, a secret she'd been forced to keep from herself. Adam nodded, a slow grounding dip of his chin. "Lena," he repeated, giving the name back to her, blessing it, making it real, and hers again, in this God-forsaken place. "You don't belong on this platform, and you don't belong to anyone who thinks they can leave you like this." For the first time, she looked up. Her eyes, the color of a rain-washed sky, met his, and in their depths he saw a devastating layering, a crust of exhaustion over a lake of fear, fear over a bedrock of profound wariness, and beneath it all, and something that chilled him more than any winter wind, a resignation so complete it was dangerously close to peace, the peace of something that has ceased to hope. "Where would I go?" she asked. It was not a challenge, but the pure, stark core of her reality, uttered with the flat certainty of a mathematical truth. A question with no answer waiting in the wings, only the echoing void of the unknown. Adam's mind flew to his empty land, his quiet, solitary hut, the days that stretched before him wide and silent as an untouched canvas of beige and gray. And in that moment, with her question hanging between them, he realized his emptiness wasn't a lack. It was space, unclaimed, undemanding space, room. "You can come with me," he said, the words leaving him before he could polish them, before fear could seal his lips. "Not forever. Not if you don't want, but for now, at least until you're safe." Lena stared, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that felt scalding, stripping away the surface to see the grain of the man beneath. She was looking for the hidden hook, the familiar contour of danger disguised as benevolence. What she found were lines etched by sun and sorrow, eyes that held their own ghosts but refused to look away from hers, and a weary sincerity that offered no promises it couldn't keep. The crowd had now stopped pretending. They watched openly, some with prurient curiosity, some with pinched disapproval that masked their own guilt, and a few with a palpable, shame-faced relief that someone, finally, had stepped into the breach they had all helped create with their silence. Adam reached out a hand, not to take hers, but to steady her as she stepped down from the platform. The simple act, her small cold hand briefly in his, a bird alighting for a terrified second, the solid, unforgiving earth beneath her feet, replacing the shameful wood, felt heavier, more significant than any contract or transaction that had ever been brokered in that God-forsaken market. It was a new covenant, written not on paper, but in the silent language of human decency. They walked away together, not fleeing, not skulking like thieves, but walking openly, leaving behind the crude stage where people had tried to turn a heart into a commodity. Lena, swallowed in his coat that hung to her knees, matched his stride, step for step, a silent shadow slowly thawing, the ice in her veins beginning to crack with the terrifying, tentative warmth of an unasked-for salvation. On the dusty road that wound toward the hills, away from the eyes and the whispers, Lena spoke. The words came in fragments, pushed out from a place long sealed shut, rusty and broken. She spoke of a border town that smelled of smoke and lies, of vague promises that glittered like fool's gold, of being a piece of cargo passed between rough hands that left bruises like signatures. She spoke of learning, lesson by brutal lesson, not to expect rescue, because hope was the sharpest knife, of all, the one you eventually turned on yourself. Adam listened. He didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. He didn't touch her. He simply walked and listened, his presence a steady, solid wall against the wind, understanding in his soul that sometimes the most profound gift you can give another shattered human being is the sacred and silent space of being heard, truly heard, for the first time. When they reached his land and the modest hut beneath a stand of whispering pines that sighed as if in relief, Lena stopped dead at the crooked fence line. It was as if crossing that boundary was too monumental, too real. To enter was to believe, however faintly, in the possibility of a tomorrow that wasn't a carbon copy of yesterday's pain. It was a leap of faith she wasn't sure her atrophied spirit could make. "You can stay," he said again, his voice softer now, gentled by the purple twilight and the profound weariness in her eyes. "As long as you need." This time, it wasn't an offer. It was a vow, spoken to the gathering stars, a quiet counterpoint to the world's betrayal. The days that followed were quiet, but their quiet was not emptiness. It was a healing. It was the sound of kneaded dough, a soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of creation. It was the rhythmic ping, ping, ping of milk in a pail, a song of sustenance. It was the crackle of a hearth fire that held the night at bay, painting their faces in warm, dancing light. Lena learned, slowly, painstakingly, how to milk the stubborn nanny goat, her initial fright softening into a focused determination. She learned how to bake bread until the crust was a perfect golden brown, the smell filling the cabin with an aroma that felt like safety. She learned, one miraculous night at a time, how to sleep deeply, her ears finally untuning themselves from the dread of approaching footsteps, her body unclenching in the profound dark. Adam learned, too. He learned how to share the silence, how to leave room for another presence in the careful, a lonely architecture of his solitude. He learned to speak of small things, the thread of rain in the clouds, the stubbornness of the north field, an old, tender memory of his mother's laughter, and found his own voice less rusty for it, less choked with disuse. He found purpose not in grand, heroic deeds, but in the daily, quiet acts of providing sanctuary, filling a water cup before it was empty, leaving an extra blanket on the stool by her pallet, the simple, steadfast act of being there. News, of course, slithered back to town on the tongues of travelers and traders, twisting and growing in the telling. Opinions divided like snakes in a basket, hissing and coiling around themselves. Some hailed him as a saint, a rare good man in a country of hard compromises. Others clucked at his foolish sentimentality, in calling him a soft-hearted fool asking for trouble, a man who'd brought a wolf cub to his hearth. A few, those with secrets that preferred the dark, whispered with venom that he'd interfered in a natural order, taken what wasn't his to take, and that the debt would come due. But Adam, splitting wood behind his cabin with a steady, powerful rhythm, found he no longer cared for the currency of their approval or disapproval. Approval had never saved a soul. Indifference had never warmed a freezing child. He knew only the tangible truth. He had chosen to see Lena when the world had chosen to look through her. That simple, defiant act of witnessing, of refusing to participate in the collective unseeing, had altered the trajectory of two lives forever, setting them on a new path whose end they could not see, but whose every step now felt chosen. And in that change, in the shared sunrise over his land turning the frost to diamonds, in the sound of a voice other than his own asking a simple question about the weather, he rediscovered something he thought grief had stolen forever. Not wealth, not reputation, but a reason to rise in the morning, a purpose, reclaimed from the very dust where he had found her. My name is Elena, and in the bitter winter of 1856, I learned that grief is not a quiet, private thing. It is a screaming storm that tears the roof off the world, exposing every hidden cruelty people so carefully hide beneath polite words, hollow tradition, and the most comforting, poisonous lie of all. That family always means protection. My grief was a raw, open country into which vultures descended and dressed in fine wool and wearing my husband's face. When my Joaquin died, the earth of his grave had not yet settled, the fresh mound still a wound in the green grass before his brothers arrived. They came not as mourners, but as officials of a grim fate, their eyes sharp with calculation, even as their mouths drooped in false sorrow. They spoke in soft, oily tones that slid over me like cold sludge, smiled thin, bloodless smiles that never touched their eyes, and their hands already moved in the air, measuring, dividing, converting the love of my life, the father of my unborn child, into columns of profit and loss in their own ledgers. The notary's room was a tomb of cold stone, smelling of damp parchment and fear. He cleared his throat, a nervous, rattling sound, his eyes darting between my swollen belly, a visible testament to a future they wished to erase, and the hungry, impatient faces of my brothers-in-law, like a trapped bird seeking an escape that did not exist. He already knew the words he read would become weapons, and his trembling hands were those of a man loading a gun he did not wish to fire. To my beloved wife, Elena, he began, voice wavering, I bequeath the cow, Estrella, and the property known as the Paso del Olvido, with all its adjacent lands. The laughter was immediate. It wasn't mere amusement. It was a brutal, unifying force of derision. It crashed against the stone walls, cruel and echoing, as if the very house had chosen to mock me, to mock Joaquin's last act of love. Sebastian, the eldest, my husband's own blood, wiped a mirthless tear from his eye. The Paso del Olvido, the manor of forgetfulness, and they called it a curse, a ruin, a tomb for the living. They wove tales of collapsed roofs and barren fields, prophesying with gleeful certainty that I would starve before the snows melted, that my child would be born into nothing but wind and ghosts, that Joaquin, in his death sickness, had played a final cruel joke on us both. They pushed the deed across the polished table toward me, as if presenting the punchline to a joke only they understood. They didn't ask if I wanted it. To them, it was refuse, and I was the receptacle into which they could sweep their problem. I was the widow, the woman, the vessel, soon to be empty of even my husband's protection. I took the pen. The room held its breath, waiting for my tears, my pleas. I gave them silence. The scratch of the pen on the parchment was the loudest sound in the room, a defiant, dry whisper. Elena. Survival, in that moment, offered no choices between good and bad, only paths between terrible and worse, and the only path left, the one they had so generously granted me with their contempt, led away from their satisfied faces and into the unknown maw of that infamous place. They watched me go, their satisfaction a palpable, greasy cloud in the room. They believed they had disposed of me cleanly, elegantly, convinced they had won simply by making me disappear into a story of failure they had already written. The road to the Pazzo was a wound in the landscape, long, muddy, and utterly desolate, flanked by skeletal trees that clawed at a leaden sky. It felt like a road leading out of the world of the living, a journey into a folktale where foolish women met their ends. Estrella, my solemn brown cow, walked beside me, her steady clopping hooves a metronome of patience in the vast silence. She was not just livestock. In that moment, she was my sole companion, my confidant, a warm, breathing testament to Joaquin's last, tangible love. I spoke to her, my voice strange in the quiet, telling her of the child in my belly, of my fear, of the cold knot of resolve that was forming in place of my shattered heart. When the house first loomed through the Galician mist, it did seem a place of nightmares. Dark moss clung to its granite stones like a funeral shroud. The windows were blind, cataract-clouded with years of dust and neglect. Its very name was whispered by villagers with a superstitious dread, a warning of pride gone before a fall. My heart for a moment faltered. Had they been right? But as I pushed open the heavy oak door, and its groan was not one of menace, but of weary release, a long-held breath exhaled. Inside, I did not find decay. I found stillness, a deep, waiting quiet, thick and velvety. The furniture stood proud under sheets of dust, the shapes of tables and chairs like sleeping giants. The great hearth was dry and ready for a flame. The beams overhead were strong and straight, holding up a roof that, while dusty, was whole. Nothing was broken in the way true ruins are. It was not dead. It was dormant. That first night I slept, truly slept, wrapped in my own shawl before the fire I built myself from wood I found stacked, dry, in a sheltered corner. I slept a dreamless, profound sleep, as if the house itself were holding its breath around me, offering not a warning but shelter, as if it had been waiting, not for an owner, but for a caretaker and for a mother. Morning revealed the truth, a truth sung by the birds in the overgrown garden and written in the clear water of the well. Beneath the tangled snarl of weeds and briars, the soil was black and rich, tender to the touch, aching for a seed. The well, when I cleared the rotted leaves, gave back my reflection in clear, cold water so sweet it brought tears to my eyes, tears of relief, not despair. Gnarled apple and pear trees, ancient and neglected, held the stubborn promise of life in their bare, reaching branches. And Estrella, faithful Estrella, gave milk, frothy, warm, abundant streams of it, filling the pail with a sound like gentle rain. the first of Sebastian's lies, the lie of barrenness, crumbled and turned to dust before the sun reached its zenith. Weeks turned into months. My body grew heavy and round with my child. A slow, sure swelling of life against all odds, but my hands grew strong and capable with work. I found old boundary stones hidden by brambles, their markings still clear beneath the lichen. I discovered a low wall, a skeleton of a forgotten herb garden, rosemary and thyme fighting through the neglect, and one day, my back aching, my fingers probing, I found it behind a cascade of ivy at the rear of the property, a small stone shed, half buried in the earth, its door sagging on rusted hinges. Inside, in the damp, earthy dark, beneath a floorboard pried up with trembling, hopeful fingers, I found the jars, simple earthenware jars, sealed with thick, dark wax that cracked like history under my knife. Inside, gleaming dully in the slanted light from the door, were stacks of silver coins, cool and heavy, and beneath them, papers, dry, decrisp, official, land deeds, mortgages marked paid in bold, triumphant script, boundary descriptions meticulously recorded, documents proving, with cold, legal precision, that much of what Sebastian now proudly called his own prosperous land had, in fact, once been part of this forgotten Pazzo's domain, stolen, not inherited. A fierce, cold understanding washed over me, colder than the well water, and more bracing. Joaquin had not left me scraps to mock me. He had left me a weapon. He had left me the buried, inconvenient truth. He had known his brothers, known their greed, and from his sickbed, he had not chosen a gift, but chosen a strategy. He had planted a seed of justice for me to find. And truth, when finally excavated, is heavier and more enduring than gold. It is the foundation stone upon which empires of lies crumble. I took the documents to the magistrate in the city, my heart a drum of defiance beneath my worn dress, my son a quiet weight in my arms. Slowly, inexorably, the great wheel of the law began to turn. It moved not with speed, but with the immutable force of a river carving a canyon. It does not rush, but it never, ever stops, and it wears down even the hardest stone of corruption. The smug, satisfied smile was wiped from Sebastian's face when the formal, wax-sealed notices arrived. It curdled into confusion, then into a sputtering purple rage, as surveyors with their chains and tripods remarked the land, as the curse of the Pazo del Olvido transformed, line by legal line, into an inheritance, and the inheritance, by right and by proof, became mine. They came then, of course, spluttering threats that sounded hollow in the clean air of my courtyard, spewing shame that slid off me like water from a newly thatched roof, trying to bully the ghost they thought they'd created back into the box of their expectations. But the woman who faced them in the doorway of the Pazzo was not the one they had laughed from the stone notary's room. My silence was no longer my refuge. It was my strength. My fear was no longer my language. I had learned a new tongue, the language of deed and boundary and right. I had been rooted in the hard, true ground of my own survival, and from that soil I had grown a spine of iron and a will of granite. When my son, Matteo, drew his first furious breath, it was not in a house of mockery, but in the sun-warmed main room of the Pazzo, filled with the clear, clean light of a Galician dawn filtering through windows I had washed myself until they shone. I held his tiny, perfect, squalling form and wept, but these were tears of fierce, triumphant joy. I whispered into the downy curve of his ear, my voice steady as the stones of my house. "You are not born into ruin, my heart. You are born into justice. You are born into a truth we dug up together. People spoke of me differently then. No longer the pitiful widow of the Pazo dell'Olvido, but that woman, the Villa woman, the one who turned a curse into a legacy, who wrested land from the jaws of wolves. Some called me lucky, a beneficiary of a dead man's sentiment. Others called me cunning, a schemer who had duped honest men. But I know the truth. It is simpler and harder. When they pushed me into the ruins, and they did not know they were pushing me onto my own foundation. When they tried to bury me in shame and forgetfulness, they were merely planting me in the deepest, richest soil I would ever know. And from that depth, in that fertile ground of truth and defiance and a mother's love, no one can ever easily pull you out again. You become part of the landscape. You become the thing that endures. If you are reading this, and you have been told you are nothing, that you will fail, that you will not survive the winter of their disregard, remember, the words meant to break you are often spoken by those who fear the height of what you might become if you ever truly grow. Sometimes, the very thing meant to be your grave becomes the ground that roots you deepest, that nourishes a strength you never knew you possessed. And from that unshakable depth, you can grow, not as a twisted, stunted thing, but straight and tall and unyielding, toward the sun,